Welcome to the Philoctetes Center. Francis Levy and I are co-directors of the center. Just a couple of announcements. Next Friday night, in the series we've been doing with the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, which is the film series, we will be showing Hamlet, and Simon Critchley, who is a philosopher, and Jamieson Webster, who is a psychoanalyst in training, will be discussing the movie afterwards. On Saturday, we have a poetry program called Poetry Scholars and Poetry Critics at 2:30 here. And Stephen Burt, Bonnie Costello, Heather Dubrow, Rachel Hadass, and Eric McHenry are the people involved. Today's roundtable on meaning and motivation has been a difficult one to organize, and I'm beginning to realize it may be because we put meaning in front of motivation. Had we not put that, I don't think we would have had as big a problem. We also tried to get a theologian here, but we were not successful, though we invited many. The way we are going to do the roundtable today is that I will briefly introduce the participants. Then each of them will tell you where they come from vis-a-vis the subject, and then they will discuss amongst them the issues that are raised, following which we will have time for the audience to ask questions. Emily Balcetis is an assistant professor of psychology at New York University, and her research interest is primarily on is the effects of motivation on visual perception and social judgment. Ned Block, who is here, is a Silver Professor in the Department of Philosophy and Psychology and Central for Neuroscience at NYU. Lawrence Friedman is Clinical Professor of Psychiatry at Weill Cornell and on the faculty of the NYU Psychoanalytic. And Edward Smith is the Director of Division of Cognitive Science at the New York State Psychiatric Institute, and William B. Ransford, Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry at Columbia University. So Emily is going to start, and then we'll go from there. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me today. I'm really excited to speak with what I'm told is a very diverse group. This is my first time of being here, so I'm excited to see where this discussion goes. One of them is, where should it even start? That's something that we've been talking about for a couple of weeks now, is what is meaning and what is motivation? And I think what we're going to find in the panel today is that we all have a very different perspective on what topics should be included with a header like this. So I thought I would just start with giving you a few anecdotes and a taste of some of the research that I've done that illustrates what I think can be encompassed within a header like this. Starting off with a few examples from the real world that illustrates why I think understanding the role of motivation and trying to glean meaning in our real world is really important. And where I want to start with is with an example from sports. I was told when I was going through school that if you want people to care about what you study, you should always try to figure out a way that sports are involved, and then people will be interested. I'm really at a loss because I know nothing about sports, except for this example that I'm going to share with you today. This is a photograph from the 1966 World Cup match. This is the final game of the World Cup series. And in this game, it's the first and only time that England has made it to the finals of the World Cup series. They were battling West Germany. It was a very surprising game because England wasn't supposed to be there. There were 98,000 people that came to the game, another 500,000 that were watching it on television in 1966. And it came as even more of a surprise when the two teams were tied at the end of regulation time. So it went into forced overtime. 11 minutes into overtime came the shot argued around the world. Here's video footage of the shot. For a goal to be counted as a goal, for a kick to be counted as a goal, it has to fully cross the goal line. So that's the shot. What do you think? Should this be a goal? Here it is again. Did it fully cross the goal line? Well, the ref on the field didn't know, so he called in the linesman, the Russian linesman, on the side, and he said, oh, it's very clear. Of course this ball fully crossed the goal line. He called it as a goal for England. So they went on to win their only World Cup title ever. So this is a highly contentious call. the Russian linesman is certain that he saw it as a goal that should be counted towards England. But of course, even to this day, Germans vehemently argue that they were robbed and that England shouldn't have gained this point. So besides being an example of how Europeans care far more about soccer than Americans do, I think it serves as a good anecdote to illustrate one of the things that I'm interested in, which is studying how we see the world, or the ways that we see the world, are really influenced by our motivations, by our desires, by the preconceptions that we have, the psychological baggage that we have that we bring to the perceptual table. So the way that we understand the world, the way we glean meaning, is going to be influenced by our motivations. And I think this is just one anecdote from the real world that illustrates that. So I wanted to share with you a couple examples of where we've tried to test this idea, this phenomenon that we call motivated visual perception, that our motivations can influence the way we see the world around us, give you a couple tastes of some of the work that we've done in the lab that illustrates the same phenomenon. So one thing that we did was just give a transcript of a couple on a first date to some participants who came into the lab. We had written out the dialogue between a couple supposedly on their first date, and all of our participants were reading exactly the same information, this couple having a nice dinner together. But what we did for half of our participants was those that were in the control condition. We said, just see if you can point out and find examples of this couple flirting with one another. That's the control condition. The other condition that we were interested in was read the same transcript, but find examples of this couple deceiving one another. So they did that for a few minutes. They thought about flirting, or they thought about deception. And then 10 minutes later, we showed them some images. And we just said, just describe what you see in these images. And this is what we showed them. What we were interested in was how would they describe this. We showed it for a very brief amount of time, just about a second. So we got their first interpretation of what this was. What do you see? You see the liar? Yeah. Okay. A liar and a face. You can see both. Do you see both? Rotate it more. So here's the L. Okay. There's a lot more. There's a lot more we can discuss in this image. It's cool because you can see two possibilities, and you and your neighbor might have very different interpretations of what this is, and you might actually have to argue that what you're seeing isn't some hallucination and that you are, in fact, seeing the right thing, and they're, in fact, seeing something that's wrong. And I think that beautifully illustrates the point that we're talking about. We can see the world in this particular example in very different ways depending on what we're thinking about beforehand. And that's what our participants showed for us, too. Those in our control condition, about 30% or so saw the word liar, but when they had the active cognitive goal of trying to detect deception, it doubled. 60% of participants see the word liar in this case. And they don't see, the interesting thing is, because we show this for a short period of time, they don't see the other possibility. These aren't participants who can recognize that there's two possibilities. They see the face or they see the liar, because we presented it for a fairly short time to capture how do they first interpret this image. But we want to give another example, too. So in this case, we wanted to condition people's motivations, condition what they're interested in, what's desirable, what they're motivated to see. So in this case, we just took random stimuli, letters and numbers. These don't really have meaning in our world. They're not associated with rewards and costs in our everyday world, but we can condition them to want letters or want numbers. So through a conditioning process, that's me, sorry. We associated letters, random stimuli, with reward, and numbers with cost. We did this by telling them, if you see a lot of letters, if the computer just happens to show you letters, you'll get something desirable. But if it shows you a lot of numbers, there'll be something undesirable. In this case, we told them the desirable thing is that you can act like an American Idol judge. You're going to watch people make fools of themselves and tell us what you think. So that's a fairly fun thing to do. The undesirable task they might have to complete, though, is singing a karaoke tune like this stocky Italian gentleman that we said was a previous participant. They watched this video. They saw him singing Gloria Gaynor's I Will Survive really poorly. And they thought, that could be me. If I see numbers, this embarrassing task could be mine. So they go into this task hoping to see letters and also not wanting to see numbers. So we condition letters to be associated with reward. That's a desirable stimulus. Numbers are an undesirable stimulus. And again, like our last study, we eventually show them an image that will determine their fate, and this is what they see. Right, so the two interpretations are more obvious in this one, but we show that to them for a very brief amount of time. They only see the B or the 13. They don't realize that there's another interpretation because of the quickness with which we present it. And so when letters are desirable because it means they get to be the American Idol judge, 70% see this as a B, and hardly any of them see it as a 13. But when we switch the reward structure, we also see now what they see has flipped, fairly substantially. When numbers are associated with reward, they see this as a B rather than a 13. So again, their motivation, their goal, what's desirable, influences the way that they make sense of a piece of visual information in their world. Okay, so you might say, well, this is really fun and great. These are cute little parlor trick demonstrations, but what does that really mean for the real world? Does this really matter? And what our lab argues is that it does matter. It matters because visual information, the meaning that we glean from our visual world around us, serves as a foundational element for more important things, like the judgments that we make, the way we interact with our world. If we are having to decide whether I want to go up and talk to Jerry Bruner, I might first look and see, does he seem friendly to me? I have to first see, is he smiling? He's smiling. That's good. So then I might engage in a social interaction with him. So the visual information that we pick up from the world around us serves as a foundational element for more important judgments or behaviors that follow. It's a foundational building blocks of our social world. And so there are two important domains where our visual experiences, which we argue are quite malleable and can be influenced by motivations, there can be pretty dramatic consequences for more important judgments than just whether I'll be an American Idol judge or not. And one particular domain in which we can see that visual perception influences important judgments is in voting behavior. We did a quick study where we looked at how do people see Obama. Obama is an important figure in our world, and he self-identifies as black, but we know he has a biracial he's a biracial political candidate, but he self-identifies as one way. How do the lay people at large see him? How do voters see him? So we did some studies where we tried to get a handle on that. Do they see him as lighter skinned than he really is? Do they see him as he really is? Or do they see him as a darker man than he really is? And does that matter? So that was talked a lot about in the news. What we did for our participants here, you can clearly see that these are two different photographs. We photoshopped them. The one on the right, we artificially altered his skin tone to be slightly lighter than it really is. The one on the left, we altered so it's slightly darker. You can clearly see that. Our participants couldn't because we presented them sequentially. So they didn't see the same image, the same stance next to each other with where the photoshopping or the coloring was different. They saw them sequentially, and we just simply asked them, indicate which one is most representative, which photograph is most representative of who Obama is. They saw some where he was dressed more casually, some where he's dressed more professionally. That's the information they thought that they were using to make these judgments or decisions about which one is really him. So then, from the judgments that we got, we could assess, do these people see him as lighter than he really is? Do they see him as darker than he really is? Or do they see him how he really is, an unaltered photograph? We captured these judgments, their perceptual experiences, a week before the 2008 election. The day after the election, we followed up with these very same participants, and we got a sense of who did they vote for. We just asked them, who'd you vote for in the last election? So then we can put our participants into each of these 6 quadrants, those who saw him as lighter and voted for Obama, or those who saw him as darker and voted for McCain, and we can get a sense of what was the voting behaviors, and can we predict that from the perceptual experiences that they had a week before the election. So here are the percentages of people that fall into these 6 categories. What I think is most striking is that their perceptual experience that they had predicted their voting outcomes. So we see here, of the participants who saw him as lighter in skin tone than he really was a week before the election, 75% of those people actually voted for him in the election. A week before the election, if they saw him as darker in skin tone than he really was, 89% of those people voted for McCain.
How do you know it wasn't the reverse?
Yeah.
That who they were going to vote for.
After they voted, they then saw the person as lighter and darker.
We asked for their perceptual. We got these perceptual measures a week before the election. So there is a minimum of 7 to 9 days of lag time in between our perceptual judgments that we collected, and then when we followed up and asked who'd you actually vote for.
Can you see photos again?
Absolutely. So it's not kind of coming through quite well on this projection for you. It really looks like sinister on the left. On the computer screen, it doesn't look quite as dark, although the skin tone has been lightened and darkened the same percentage, about 15% change in both cases. So it's subtle when they're presented sequentially. When you see them side by side, it's obvious. But our participants didn't pick up on the fact that we had photoshopped the images. Okay, so it matters. So here's some evidence that the way that we see the perceptual experiences that that these participants had a week prior to the election predicted real important behaviors in the real world. There was this relationship between biased perceptual experiences that we could predict, which we could predict from their political ideology, other motivations that they have. We could predict how they are going to see him, and then from the biased perceptual experiences, we were able to predict statistically who they were going to vote for.
How did you determine how they saw him?
Yeah, I think at this point those are more detailed, probably too detailed right now than we need to get into. We did ask them to indicate on a 1 to 7 scale how representative is this photograph of who Obama really is. So they gave us continuous judgments on a number of photographs that they saw. So they didn't just have to pick one. They could indicate that they're all the same. They're all highly representative. So another domain, and besides voting behavior, that's really important, arguably, is the legal decision. So we know that in the legal system, we're presented with evidence. The evidence is there for everybody to see. Everyone gets presented with the same evidence. And then we need to make judgments and decisions about what does this evidence mean. But our legal system takes for granted that we can all see the same evidence if it's brought to the court. If a lawyer presents some evidence, we'll all see it the same way, but our judgments are going to be biased. And that's not true. That's what our lab is showing. That's what a number of labs are showing, is that even in the legal system, the way that people see evidence is very different. And then again, the consequences are quite great, because acting as jury members or lawyers or judges, where there's a big burden of responsibility, a big task at hand for the judgments that are made. So I want to give you just one last example. Here's the last thing I'll share with you, arguing that our perceptual experiences matter and that they're malleable. It goes back a few years now. A couple years ago, there was a civilian, Victor Harris, who was being pulled over by a police officer, Officer Scott. This happened in Georgia. The civilian wasn't pulling over. The police officer and the civilian ended up in a high-speed chase through a fairly residential neighborhood. And this went on for a while, and the civilian clearly wasn't stopping. So here is video footage from the police officer's car. After the civilian wasn't stopping, the police officer engaged in this tactical move. And we see here that tactical move led the civilian to lose control of his car and ended up in this crash where the civilian was paralyzed. So very serious consequence of this tactical move that the police officer took to end the high-speed chase. The civilian sued the police officer for damages, and the first court sided with the civilian and said that the police officer was in the wrong. Interestingly, this was the main piece of evidence that was submitted to the court system. The juries and the lawyers and the judges watched the same videotape taken from this is just the last little bit. This chase went on for about 20 minutes. This is the tactical move, and this is video footage from...
Does he actually touch the car?
Yes. He rams the back of the car to end the chase. And so that's the move that's in question, is this move warranted? Is this a justifiable act on the police officer's part? After they watched 20 minutes of the video that preceded it, taken from the dashboard camera of the police officer's car. So the first courts sided with the civilian and said this move was not warranted, and the police officer is in the wrong. The police officer appealed through all the appellate courts. They sided with the original decision, the original court's ruling, and said that the police officer is in the wrong. It went all the way up to the federal Supreme Court, actually. And this case was just heard a couple years ago. And again, submitted as evidence, the primary evidence used in this case is this video footage, which we all watched. Interestingly, at the federal Supreme Court level, the justices reversed the decision, and they said, well, we're watching this video, and we see something entirely different than what all the lower order courts saw, what all the jury members in all of the other cases saw. We see something entirely different. And no juror in their right mind would be able to see it any differently. So they even questioned all of the perceptual experiences of all the jury members that preceded them. So 8 of the 9 Supreme Court justices said, based on this evidence, we think that the police officer was in the right. And in fact, in the ruling, they implicated this phenomenon that we're talking about. Justice Breyer said, if I see with my eyes that that's what happened, what am I supposed to do? So what I think is particularly interesting about studying this phenomenon of motivated visual perception in the legal system is that all the people involved in legal decision-making are highly trained to view evidence, objective evidence, or what the legal process constitutes as objective evidence. If we present it, we'll see it in the same way, and then we can discuss the judgments that we should make. But what this is suggesting is that even people who are highly trained to see the evidence in the same way come up with very different interpretations, which has extreme consequences for the more important judgments that they're making. So for me, what I'm interested then in is studying this phenomenon of motivated visual perception. The take-home message that I'd like to get out there is that motivations influence the information that we extract from our environment. We extract it through our perceptual faculties. And this phenomenon of motivated visual perception serves as input for judgment, understanding, and the meaning that we glean from our world around us.
Thank you. Ed, you want to go?
Sure. A tough act to follow. I don't have any PowerPoint, so I'll just say a little bit about my background, what I'm interested in. I'm basically started in cognitive psychology, and for the first half of my career, I really did work on issues that were related to meaning in some sense, namely the meanings of words, very influenced by the philosopher Wittgenstein, also very influenced by Jerry Bruner, who had broken open this area in the 1950s. And we get a little louder. Better? Better? So, yes, much better. So, following the work that Jerry had done earlier, we were interested in questions like whether word meanings really corresponded to definitions or if they were more structured according to prototypes and exceptions from those prototypes. And I think one way to look at what we did in that time was we're trying to get experimental evidence for something like the Wittgenstein proposals. Then around the early 90s, neuroimaging came through. PET was developed so that it could positron emission tomography could now be used for brain imaging purposes, and I thought, oh my God, we can look at people's brains while they do various psychological tasks, and I haven't looked back since then. We started trying to study some of the same issues about semantics, but for uninteresting reasons, it didn't work out well, and we switched into memory, particularly short-term and working memory, where there was a lot of very important data that had been accumulated from monkeys and other species about the nature of working memory. And so I got heavily involved in that, and I did that for up until a few years ago. And a few years ago, in the third half of my career, I have switched into research on schizophrenia. And I now split my time between Columbia Psychology Department and the Medical Center uptown, where I'm part of the New York State Psychiatric Institute. And there, some of my research continues to be on working memory, which is of extremely important deficit in schizophrenia. It appears before almost any other symptoms. It's found in first-degree relatives who are not symptomatic, and so on. And I could talk about that, but that doesn't actually make contact with either meaning or motivation. But fortunately...
But just briefly say what working memory is as a...
Short-term memory. Just think of it as short-term memory. About the use of the term working memory has come about because of the idea that when you're thinking and reasoning, you're doing it on the contents of what's in an active memory. And so, but as it turns out, in the last 2 years, I've been working on issues. Also been working on issues of motivation in schizophrenia in particular, and starting a drop in depression. And in schizophrenia, there is a phenomena akin to what you see in depression of anhedonia, where the people who have this disorder have difficulties getting enjoyment or pleasure out of some activities. Actually, that itself is a matter of debate. What seems to be more a consensus belief is that people who have schizophrenia lack motivation to do much. They lack kind of incentive. They lack the ability to anticipate pleasure. And we try and study this by brain imaging. One of the reasons this seems to us to be a fertile area is one of the limited number of topics that has really produced consistent results in brain imaging in time after time and experiment after experiment has to do with what people find rewarding. That they're really, I think one of the important breakthroughs of neuroimaging is that it has found something that looks like reward circuitry in the brain. So we can actually be focusing on those regions while we ask questions about, are patients with schizophrenia less able to get excited or anticipate something positive? What happens if it's negative? Does that have different kinds of consequences? And so on. So my connection to meaning is quite old. My connection to motivation is very new. Ned?
So I'm a philosopher of mind. And one of the things I'm really quite interested in is perception. So I find the line of work that Emily is doing, following on the work of Jerry Bruner, to be extremely fascinating. I'll say just very briefly something that I'm working on now, and then I'll make a comment on some of the things that Emily was saying. So one of the things that I'm interested in now is the difference between conscious perception and unconscious perception. And I don't know of how many people in the psychiatric world are in here, but I'm actually quite curious whether the study of unconscious perception has anything to tell us about any other aspects of the unconscious. The thing is, we can really get very detailed, hard evidence in the case of unconscious perception. And of a kind that I don't think it's that easy to get when it comes to other unconscious phenomena. So maybe the unconscious perception can serve as something of a model. One very interesting phenomenon, but with a couple of different kinds, is that in unconscious perception, is that we actually have an interaction between conscious perception and unconscious perception, sometimes involving the very same object. And I'll just give you a few examples. I wish I'd brought my computer. I thought, oh, maybe I should bring it because I have. But I'm sure everybody's familiar with the Muller-Lyer illusion. You know, it's a line, and you either see this bracket or this bracket. And then there's a similar one called the Judd illusion, where you either see it, you can see it like this. It's two different facing ones. Okay, so put that in your push-down storage. There's another interesting phenomenon known as visual spatial neglect. It's where people can't attend to the left side of space. In many patients, the effect of this is they just don't see what's on the left side. They don't see consciously what's on the left side. So one patient was studied actually by a guy at CUNY named Tony Rowe. And when he showed this patient a number of Muller-Lyer and Judd illusion figures and asked whether they were the same or different. And what he found was that they categorized them entirely on the basis of the right side. As far as the left side goes, they just didn't see it. They were fixating in the middle, and so it was the left side of their visual space. Then he decided to see whether the unseen left side actually had an effect on where they thought the midpoint of the line was. And what he discovered was something, well, first of all, in all cases of neglect, if you ask people to bisect the line, they are always a little off to the right. But what he was able to do is to factor that out and to show that the unseen left side produced the normal illusion effect, just as if they had seen it consciously. So there we have a single object. So, in other words, just to be clear, they would have two figures with the same right side, but different left sides. As far as the subject was concerned consciously, those two figures are identical. but the place where they bisect the line is different because of the unconsciously seen left side. So here we have a case of a single representation. In the, people who study perception believe we have perceptual representations in the brain. We have subjects with a single perceptual representation, part of which is unconscious, part of which is conscious, and those two aspects of it interact. Now, that's really an interesting phenomenon, I think, and there are many different kinds of different versions of it. So one case some of you may be familiar with is if you take, this is work done by Marlene Berriman, if you take two circles and put a line between them so that they seem to form a single object, and you ask the subject to fixate in the middle, many subjects won't consciously see the thing on the left. But then if you rotate the whole thing so that the seen right side one is now on the left, they see the one on the left. So they have a visual percept of the whole object, and the force of that consciously seen part can drive away some of the neglect. Another quite different kind of example is where there are ways of inducing unconscious perception, and I kind of wish I brought my laptop now because I could actually show you this. But many of you may have heard of a phenomenon known as binocular rivalry. So this is you can do this at home. You can take a tube from a paper towel holder. You put it on one eye, and then you show one eye one thing, and then you show the other eye another thing. If you're getting very different contrasts in the two eyes, what you will find is there will be just a little initial period of kind of mixed together, and then what you're seeing is first one of them, then the other, then the other. They alternate about every 2 to 3 seconds. Now, an incredibly fascinating phenomenon is if you give a very actively moving colored object, which these have now been very finely tuned. Jeremy Wolf first discovered that a very actively moving object in binocular rivalry would capture the conscious impression. And then now Tsuchiya showed an even better one where you can get somebody to be looking at this thing, and they'll see the actively moving thing, and there can be some other thing in the other eye, and for a minute or two at a time, that thing will be unconsciously seen, and you know it's seen because it has all kinds of effects in your later behavior, but it's unconsciously seen. So here's something they did, which is that it was noticed in this that very emotional stimuli could break through the cloak of invisibility. And so they decided to actually do a little test of what emotionality would lead to what. And the results are kind of interesting. But the very simplest result is that a fearful face breaks through invisibility faster than an upside-down fearful face or a neutral face. And I won't go into the whole detail of how they did this, but they used a very controlled experiment where they could just time with individual subjects. So what we have here again is that this one representation is first unconscious and then conscious. So you can do a controlled experiment in which you have an unconscious representation that in a minute or two will become conscious. So, I don't know much about the psychiatric end of things, but gosh, we now have these facilities for doing, for putting together for seeing the conscious and unconscious side of percepts. It's got to be useful for some purposes that have something to do with psychodynamics. I'm not sure how, but it really would be nice, I think, if people who are in the kind of psychiatric end of things would, do some joint projects with people who do perception. It's really quite interesting. So I guess I've said enough. So,
Larry, do you see any?
Well, I think I was thinking while you were saying these last comments that when we want to know what the effect of attention is on retrieving or merging or whatever, the unconscious perception with.
Can I say something about
Please,
it? This is through and through an attentional phenomenon. So what that fast-moving thing does is it attracts your attention. And then what the fearful face does is it attracts your attention back to the other eye.
So I think, but from what you say, it sounds like this might have very good applicability to what practitioners do in psychotherapy, even though they're dealing with different sorts of stimuli and different ways of trying to orient attention. Although many of them may be similar in the sense that they may be alarming or extremely worrisome. I mean, the analyst or the therapist may. Let me talk. Would you want to take this topic and move on with it?
Go ahead.
On that topic.
Anything you want.
Well, I mean, I'd like to learn about this, but I guess if I'm supposed to take my turn, I ought to say that I'm Larry Friedman, that I don't have a technology or to offer. And then the thing that strikes me about my role or my position that's different here is that I represent practitioners, as well as a practitioner is somebody who has one foot, you might say, in the real world, in the very real sense of real world, in that it's a world where you can be hurt. I guess that's as real as you can get for a world. So the practitioner and the patient are always sort of on the edge there. So one foot in the real world, and the other foot in a kind of speculation, and anything that's added from the hard sciences to the speculation is always useful. But the analyst or analytic therapist has a different problem than a researcher, although when you alter your variables, you're doing something a little similar. In that, quite obviously, the analyst is trying to change something. Now, they may talk about it in different ways, in more sort of postmodern ways or something like that. Bob Michaels would say he's just trying to create more interesting ways of looking at things or something. But that's still a change. But generally speaking, he has to change something. So he's got a practical challenge, even though I may not be feeling that at every moment. And that challenge gives him a hands-on operation. And he tends to think of that operation, I guess we think of, everybody's wondering whether these top meaning and motivation, how they come together. This is really a psychoanalytic pair. I mean, this is what psychoanalysis is concerned about. Because in a sense, what he's trying to do is he's reacting, he's himself focused on meaning, and he's trying to read out of it motivation. What he'll do with that is something else from the patient's standpoint. So he, in a sense, inside himself is trying to, in some ways, separate them. And it's a challenge. That is, somebody will present something to him. I'll first speak about the therapist side of it. Then I'll speak about it. Somebody will present something to him, and he'll see it as an effort to do something, and many schools, to do something to him, and also a report or a communication of something, and he will operate on it, not in a laboratory sense. The ways that he operates on it, in brief, for Freudian analytic types, is that he will remove as much as he can of the context, which the patient is depending on to define his meaning. That's one thing that he'll do. Take it away, and therefore try to make the meaning barer, since it won't be, the patient won't find that he can assume a reaction or assume a reception of the meaning of a certain sort. So he'll have to try harder. That's one thing that he does. And that's not a comfortable thing for either party, by the way. I mean, in fact, it's a dreadful thing because it interferes with the ordinary social way of keeping meaning, minimizing how much emotion or how much motivation is present at the moment. You don't want your partner to know at any one moment all the motivations you may have. I think that's clear. I don't think I'd have to explain that. You wouldn't want everyone to know what's in the back of your mind as you're looking at. I wouldn't want you to. I wouldn't want to know what you're thinking. I'll tell you that. I really wouldn't. Not in this context. So ordinary socialization allows us to sort of communicate or express certain things while, in effect, leaving the motivations for it either obscure or leaving them standardized, and then the individual motivations obscure. And the analyst is trying to bear the motivation or compound of motivations, because it's not. So he's operating in that sense. It's an experiment, if you like, in that respect. That he's trying to find out. He has to register what the meaning is. He has to think of it also as a way of affecting him in ways that the person may not know and certainly wouldn't want him to know, and so on, and try to separate them. So his conceptual problem, insofar as he's not just in the moment of treating, if he goes home and he's trying to figure it out, is to try to figure out, like, what this thing that we're discussing is. What is the relationship between meaning and motivation? And he has, when he stops to think about that, it's not just a philosophical question for him, because it challenges the nature of his whole job and his life and his career, and we tend to get pretty invested in it. So if, for example, as we've seen, and I think this is a cardinal example, this is one of the cardinal agonies of thinking about psychoanalytic therapy. Well, it may not put it that way. You saw that motivation affects perception. Now, we're not even talking here. It would be even worse if it was a question. Motivation surely affects how you understand somebody talking, because you will wonder, what are they trying to get across to you? What position do they have with regard to you? What's their status? But if it's even vision, as Emily says, even vision, if motivation affects vision, how is somebody who is in vision, so to speak, like the analyst, going to change any kind of motivation? How does he have any control at all? And that's, like the cardinal problem of psychodynamic therapy, psychoanalytic therapy, and the way it's phrased. I'm sure you know this is in common knowledge that analysts consider that the way the patient sees them is often or always a transfer, depending on what school you come from. There's always a transference. That is, it's a motivated misperception, which may accidentally be appropriate to and draws in reality, and we won't go into that. But insofar as there's some trouble in living, it's likely it will be expressed in some way this way. And insofar as that's a paradigm, that's something that in some way you want to change, either by having alternatives or being able to look at it or stand apart from it or something. Now, if you're the person that's supposed to do the changing, and you're perceived by the thing that's, say, the state that is supposed to change, that determines who you are, how will you ever, what reason do you think you would ever have to be able to change anything that people perceive, or the way they are, or the way they see the world, or anything? You are going to be assimilated into it. That is sort of, in a large exaggeration, the consequence of this, if you want to put it that way. And it's not something that analysts have. They really, in some ways, kick the ball down the road. The ways that they've usually tried to get around the story is really to hype. And this is something I hope will be discussed, because I'm talking about change, and this kind of misperception is one of the things that's being spoken about. That the analysts, since it's so hard to answer, they'll say there's such a thing, and I think we all think there is, as an observing ego. And it may be, a Piagetian decentered lighthouse, which surveys oneself, something that's objective. And that seems very doubtful once you look at, at this study. You're looking with all the observing ego you could possibly have. I don't know what would happen if somebody said, I am going to try to deliberately, I'm going to try to get rid of all the influences of my biases. And now give me the test again or something. I don't know what that do. One of the questions I want to ask is that, because all that an analyst can ever do, in a way, is to alter attention, either directly by talking or by the way he is or something like that. And if attention can alter the way you perceive, there's some kind of chance, one small chance that things can change if you find the trick or if there's a way of doing it. But in theory, they might say, well, there's this observing ego that stands aside from motivation. It's a very unpsychoanalytic idea, but it's stuck in there, because in order to get him off the hook, there has to be something there that's on my side, something that isn't seeing it the way the patient wants. And the only other thing I'll say really is I'm talking from the standpoint of the analyst trying to change, but the thing from the patient's standpoint, of course, they're seeing a reality, just like these people are seeing a reality. This has been a cause of great dissension, modern controversy in analytic circles, where analysts are inclined to say, you used to call all these things transference, but who are you to say? First of all, you can't see yourself as a therapist. What makes you think that when the patient says, you said this, you look that way, that you're noticing it's transference because I never did it, I'm not that way, you are in no way a judge of that any more than the patient is. So from the patient standpoint, they're often frustrated from the standpoint that the analyst may, especially in the older days, say, I'm the judge of that. And this is, I say, a great bit of dissension. But then you get into the question of whether there is any reality at all. And there, when you think about that, and then people nowadays, more advanced ones of us, the field of people who are really emancipated, and say, no, there isn't really. We make it up as we go along, and there isn't. I mean it. You're much safer to say that now. Nobody will laugh at you if you say something else. They're really going to. But it does. When I think about this matter, and I try to get a handle on it, it does seem to me, though, what I'm saying now is already refuted in a sense by your work, that there is a difference between vision and a storyline. I mean, I can see that there's many more different items. Hayden White, I think, is the guy to think about. And many more different decisions go in automatically into your processing a storyline, even though the primitive image of a story happening is there almost from birth or very quickly. So, there it seems much more variable what kind of reading you give. If somebody says, you've been doing this with me as a narrative, it seems a lot harder to say, oh no, there's only one way of saying what I've been doing with you. And that's a little different from, no, I don't have a mustache, it's your transference. It seems different. I don't know quite how to get it. Okay.
I just wanted to comment quickly. With regard to your question about whether these things can be changed, I think psychologists would distinguish between, and probably Ned as well, will distinguish between multiple different kinds of levels. Ned talked about this Mueller-Liar illusion. Will it help you to break that illusion by really trying hard? The answer is no. It looks like we've got the goods on that. I mean, if I pay you more money to break the illusion, will that help? No. It really seems to be something that the philosophers have referred to as cognitively impenetrable. On the other hand, if you're asking about a facial expression, and can you change your reaction to that emotional expression on the face? Absolutely yes. In that you can tell people if the face looks like it's frowning to you, unhappy or something, think of it as if it were encased in a frame, as if it were a picture. And you can see, not only will people find it then less emotional, you will see the emotional reactivity in the brain decrease. So your question clearly depends on the level. There are some cases where we can't do it, and there are some cases where it's easy enough to train people to do it. And I would think that a lot of the situations you're talking about, yes, you could do it.
I love the device that you use there. I think I may use it myself. The frame, put it in a frame, sure. Think of it as a picture.
Okay, so I think it's important to distinguish among a number of different kinds of cases. So Emily in her talk mentioned 3 kinds of cases, and then Ed's actually just mentioned another one. So let's take the one that Ed mentioned. So I would guess that this is a case where the subjects who are thinking of something as in a frame are combining mental imagery with vision, which we know can be done. There's experimental proof that you can superimpose. There's a guy in Scotland whose name I can't remember has shown that you can superimpose a grid of dots that you see that you can show people one, take it away, and then they can superimpose that on a grid of dots on a screen and find the missing dot. If there's people can superimpose images on percepts, and my guess is it's that. So there are certain effects of belief and motivation on perceptual experience that we can demonstrate in a lab.
Ned, I can say to the person, don't worry about the expression. It's a professional actor. And you get the reduction in the brain, you get the reduction in behavior. So this leads me to another point. So if you think of, so that fits with one of the points. So I saw 3 different kinds of cases of the ones that Emily mentioned. One is a kind of interpretation, and I think this fits with that. Right.
It may not change how it looks, but it changes how you interpret it. Okay. A second, and I would say that video is that. I'm not sure that the difference in whatever people were bringing to that literally changed the way it looked. It changed their but I don't know the full details of that. Okay, a second kind of case is where you've got an ambiguous stimulus, like the 13 and the B. Now there we have another case. We have experimental proof, I think it should persuade anybody, that the categories you bring can determine which way you see a stimulus. Another case that Emily didn't mention explicitly, but you mentioned, is the case where how you attend influences what you see. And we actually have a colleague, Marissa Carrasco, who has explored this in great detail and given extremely strong experimental proof that attention changes a number of different things. And in particular, attending makes a grid look higher in contrast. It makes something look bigger than it would be if you didn't attend to it. It makes something look faster than if you hadn't attended to it. If you see 2 simultaneous flashes, the one you're attending to appears to occur 40 milliseconds earlier. And the method of showing that is very simple, which is that if you give people 2 dials and ask them to adjust the events so that they're simultaneous, but then you get them to attend to one side, they adjust the one side they're attending to 40 milliseconds later. So you can show that attention is worth 40 milliseconds in perception of an event. So we can show that attention affects perception in a pretty rigorous way. Now, the remaining case that I think is still controversial is the Obama color kind of case. Do beliefs and motivations actually affect what color the person's skin looks to you? Does it affect the way it literally looks to you? And I would say the jury is still out in that. I know Emily would disagree with me on this, but now there are a number of experimental paradigms. So let me just mention one that looks goes sort of in the other direction. Emily knows about. This is the work of Keith Payne. So you probably have read about his experiments in time. There was, he's been in the press a lot. So he did these experiments where you show a person a black face or a white face, and then a gun or a wrench, and you look at the misperceptions of a gun as a wrench and misperceptions of a wrench as a gun. And of course, people see the black face, they're much more likely to misperceive the wrench as a gun. Or sorry, they say they saw a gun. But now we can ask, did it really look like a gun? So he did an interesting, he's done many different versions of this, but one suggests that it doesn't look like a gun. And here's how he did it. He got people, he gave them very brief stimuli, and then he got them to say, after they gave their response, one of three categories. Did you see the details, the visual details, like the handle or things like that, or did you just know it was a gun, or did you just know it was a wrench, or were you just guessing? And what he found was that most of the bias, where if you see a black face, you see the wrench as a gun, came in the I just knew, but I didn't see any details, suggesting that actually the black face, white face did not affect people's perception. It affected something else that you might call the interpretation of their perception or something like that. So there are kind of mixed, and another actually mixed result that maybe Jerry can tell us something about. So I know you found. So Jerry did some of these experiments in the 1940s that really were the beginning of this experimental paradigm. But he found that if you induce vigilance, many of the effects decrease or go away. So that leads one, I don't know quite what the right interpretation of that is, but at least one possibility is that what you're doing is it's not affecting the way things really look, but it's the vigilance is making you more careful about your interpretation. There's a lot of evidence, and Ed mentioned the Muller-Lyer illusion. You cannot make it go away, and most visual illusions are like that.
Right.
And the word that he used, the cognitive impenetrability. Well, another word that people use is modularity. A lot of things in our perceptual systems work automatically, and the only way you can affect them is by attention or perceptual, or if you get an ambiguous result, perceptual categorization. Knowing something about the category can change things.
What's the advantage of having this impenetrability?
Well, that some things should be really hardwired, so you shouldn't have to figure them out all the time. We want some things to be automatic as possible, and perhaps that's what we want for the low levels of vision. A very famous kind of another example of that is you can't not understand a word in your own language, all right? If you hear it, you've understood it. You can't kind of stop that. You can't stop the access of meaning of a word in your own language. That is an obvious benefit, right? We're very, very good at language understanding.
So what would be the benefit of this?
Of the Muller-Lyer illusion? I would guess, and we have people who are more knowledgeable about perception than I am, including, you have no idea how much of this Jerry did in the 40s and 50s. But I would guess that Muller-Lyer illusions probably hinging on things like perceiving horizontal lines, which is just done at the very first, just at the moment that visual information enters the brain. And so, again, that's probably not going to be the kinds of things that are malleable in Emily's kinds of paradigms. It's not going to be the kind of thing that's open to interpretation. You don't want everything open to interpretation. I just want to get this one thing.
Okay.
Well, I think this is a really interesting issue to talk about. How strong is the effect? Is this a trick that happens because our memory kicks in, or it flashes up on the screen and we wait a little bit and then we have to say what we saw? So there's room for us to have error. But so one of the big questions then is it really, how strong is this effect? How strong is this effect of our motivations on our perceptual experience? We can use words impenetrable or malleable or modular, but really the question is, how strong is this effect? Is it just a trick? Is it a fluke? Or is it a real thing? Are we really seeing something in a very different way based on the motivations that we have? And then, is it good or bad? That's the second issue that I think is on the table now with what we've brought up. So here's some really cool stuff that I want to share with you that's hot off the presses that I think suggests, maybe Ned will still disagree with me, that this really is affecting some level that is questionably at the level of attention. I don't think this is. I think this is a real perceptual phenomenon that shows that this is a good thing, actually. So this is some work that one of my graduate students has just been wrapping up this semester. It's very cool. She brought in She brought in people in relationships. She brought in undergraduates between 18 and 25 years old. Some of them are in strong relationships, been together for 3 months. That's a very long time for it's a very long time for our undergraduates to be dating. Those are strong, committed relationships. And then she also brought in same demographic, our NYU undergraduates who aren't dating somebody. All of these participants get basically the same experience. We're going to have you meet a new person in the lab, get to know each other, have a fun conversation, and just see what you think of each other. Everyone's coming in to meet a new person. Some of them are in relationships, some of them are not in relationships. And they fill out some information, kind of like Match.com or some online dating site, kind of like that, describing what they're like, what their personality is, and just a little bit about who they are. We take their photograph, and then we say, we're going to pass this information along to the person who's sitting in the room next to you. There's nobody in the room next to them. They don't know that. But we have a staged profile of somebody. It makes them seem interesting, but not too interesting, just kind of a likable person. And there's also a photograph, supposedly, of this person they're going to meet. What we manipulate, though, is the availability of the target, of this other person. Are they in a relationship or are they single? And we also manipulate how hot are they? Is this a photograph of someone who looks really attractive, or is it uglier version of somebody that they could meet? So there's two qualities about this other person that they're going to interact with. They're either single or in a relationship. They're either hot or they're not. And
how do you manipulate the hotness?
We did extensive pre-testing with all of our subjects, gave them an array of photographs. Who are the hot people? We chose the hot ones, and then who's not so hot? They
have an account with Starbucks.
Yeah. So that's what they see. All of our participants come in, they see this little description, seems nice. They see a hot or a not hot photograph of somebody who's either single or who's already in a relationship. And then we just, we have them read the information, and then we say, all right, now tell us, we're going to show you another photograph and tell us which is the photograph that we showed you. But just so that this is easier, here's the original photograph that we showed you. Here's the person you're going to meet, and that's on their screen. Next to them, right next to that photograph, is an array of other photographs where we've slightly tweaked it again. They see 11, I think, photographs that are all the same person, but we morphed them with a really hot superstar model or with a really ugly person. They see 11 photographs that is of the same person, but slightly tweaked to be a little hotter, a little hotter, a little hotter, a little uglier, a little uglier, a little uglier. And we just told them, which is the photograph of the person that you're going to meet. Oh, and by the way, here's the original. So they can see original, and then just choose which one matches up. So what we find in this is that the participant's own relationship status matters. If they're in a relationship, they see the person basically as they are. They're able to pick out the original photograph. Sometimes they even pick out slightly uglier versions of the hot person. But if they're single, everyone looks hot. So when they see that photograph, and then they're even hotter when that person is single, when the person they could meet is single themselves. So when they're an available person, somebody else that maybe I'm going to get to know, maybe I'm going to like, we argue that they are seeing that photograph as a more attractive version of the person that they're going to meet because that person is available to them and they seem interesting. However, hold on, let me land this point. Okay. So when they're in a relationship that they tell us that they're committed to, what we argue is that they see these attractive alternatives, the single person who's hot, they see them as less attractive. We argue and we conjecture that that's to mitigate the temptingness of the alternative in order to help them sustain their committed relationship. I mean, that's the conjecture. That's the story that we hope to tell. What I'm telling you now is hot off the presses as of last week, this perceptual bias that's happening.
So is it, I'm not getting the full details, so is it... the original is on, like, they're seeing it simultaneously.
Yeah, they see it simultaneously.
With the 11.
Yeah.
And then the question is, which of these 11 matches this?
Yeah,
one?
and there is an exact match up there. The right option is up there, and then 5 that are more attractive and 5 that are uglier. And we just look to see, how are they seeing this person that they're going to meet in a couple minutes.
Is there a sex difference?
No, we don't see a sex difference.
Are they sequential?
We mix them all up. No, we mix them all up so that they can't really tell like what is different. When we ask them, we try to. They can tell that something. Oh, that photograph's a little off, or that one's that's like clearer or something. They can't really explicitly tell us what you've done is morph this with a hotter and uglier person. They don't have that conscious awareness of that's the difference between these 11 photographs because they're all just slightly tweaked, but we know how they're tweaked.
Well, I mean, it's just on a general level, that rings a bell, because I think most practitioners tend to feel that where patients have where a kind of hope is resurrected for some reason, and it can start really right in the immediate relationship, but it could go on, that the perception also shifts towards amenability, shifts toward a more beatific view, or whatever you want to call it more generally. As a matter of fact, there was an analyst who's very much neglected. I don't know why. Well, I do know why, but did some wonderful work named Thomas French, who was, I guess it was because he was associated with Franz Alexander, who was associated with a corrective emotional experience. But he would track, and this is only indirectly relevant, but what you tell me reminds me, he would track a patient's dreams through an analysis, and he would see how old hopes are reopened, and a person's dreaming then has they're dreaming a more successful, in some way, approach to the long ago buried wishes that they had. And it seems to me that when we think about what are the variables that an analyst would have in altering perception, some of them have already been mentioned. One of them is attention, and the other was and the ways that you can focus attention. There was something else too, but the idea of hopefulness actually altering the appearance, in this case, actual appearance, and really distinctly, measurable, would certainly be true on a more general scale of vision of people, the universe. I've always been intrigued, not as a therapist, but just as a person, but also it's illustrated therapy. In the circle, the vicious circle and otherwise, what is it, virtuous circle that we have, that everybody knows that when people are, I have a friend, for example, who assumes that he'll be liked by everybody, and the consequence is that he is liked by everybody. I mean, it never enters his mind the kind of thing that somebody would ordinarily react to and say, oh, I guess that person felt offended, or they don't like me, because it doesn't even occur to him, as a hypothesis. Whereas we know people who are at the polar opposite, and we know what consequences that has. So, it seems very plausible to me what you say on even on the basic level of vision.
Your mother may have something to do with that. You were going to say something else, I thought.
Not really. I think we keep coming back to some of the same issues. There's a lot of malleability in interpretation. There's enormous malleability due to attention. It's probably one of the most important of all psychological constructs. And it's absolutely real. If you tell someone to attend to a particular position in space and there's nothing there, you get activation in exactly that part of the visual cortex that encodes exactly that location. All you have to do is attend. So there can be very low-level effects of attention and interpretation. And I guess the kind of questions raised by Emily's study is, can her results be explained in terms of interpretation rather than that there's something has actually changed visually? But we'll leave it till the study comes out.
So, are you ready to take questions from the audience?
Sure.
You'll have to come to the microphone, otherwise you won't be.
I wonder if before we have questions, I wonder if Jerry would like to say.
Yeah,
Jerry, certainly they brought the microphone out for him. So.
Sorry. I don't know whether I really need a The question that comes to mind is a familiar enough one. The way we go about studying perception is instantaneous, so to speak. As I go back to my own career, I remember the days when we got the engineers at MIT to design. Take that thing off, maybe. All right. No, that's it. We got the engineers at MIT to design us something which is called a tachistoscope, which can present the world at 1/1000th of a second, and we would show them a picture and say, tell us what it was. The fact of the matter is, I become increasingly aware of the fact that the notion of instantaneous perception is a total make-believe invented by psychologists. The fact is that you look at things in terms of how they fit into a kind of a sequential kind of point that Emily's been making a good deal. But when you ask what it is that determines it, the picture that you get is a little piece out of a longer sequence, which is better described as some kind of a narrative or something of the sort. And we know the overall story. But when you take, and I think of those poor undergraduates that I used to take into my lab and show them these flashes at 1/1000th of a second on my tachistoscope, what in the hell kind of a world could they have thought this was? It relates again to a point that you were making. So I want to say that that the basic way of studying perception goes back to the ancient ways of studying what used to be called sensation, sort of flash. We don't see the world in flashes. We don't understand it that way. We see it in sequences, and this is a hunk out of a sequence. So I don't know. I'm not exactly sure how to do it, but I can see someone is getting at some of the things that you were showing before. How you interpret it. So that's the kind of thing, and that's the thing that led me increasingly to move away from my tachistoscope and move eventually over to the area of studying the nature of narrative. And now I'm deeply involved in the question of the way in which narratives affect testimony in courts of law. I'm a law professor also. If somebody said, asked me what happened instantaneously, well, I would raise my hand. I object, Your Honor. It's not meaningful. I mean, what we're constantly dealing with are sequences, which doesn't mean that the instantaneous thing is not symptomatic of the sequence, a point that Ned was making along the way like that. But that's the general point of the artificiality of the way in which we've rendered the concept of perception.
Just add a famous real-world example. In the Rodney King case, which centered on did the police beat Rodney King? Did they throw the first punches? Were they beating him? The evidence was overwhelming if you look at the film. What the defense did is slow down the film so slowly that you couldn't tell whose punch came first. And the notion of the sequence of perception that makes a kind of narrative was totally destroyed. And I believe they won the case.
Not surprised.
Really quick.
Just a quick preamble. My name's Alice Labrie, and I'm former U.S. Department of State Foreign Service. I'm also a Republican who lives in Harlem. And I would like to address myself to Ms. Balcetis. Is that pronounced? First of all, you were dead right about the last segment about how people self-censor if they're in a relationship. Dead on.
Is that a personal experience?
Yeah, and I've been divorced, single, and widowed. I've seen it all. So my question, I'm fascinated. I'm totally Republican law and order here. The comment about, the federal judges that overrule, I wonder how much our political background influences, because I would have voted for the policeman right off, So do you know what the 8 judges who overruled, what was their political leanings? Do you know?
Supreme Court, right?
It was the federal Supreme Court.
Right, but of those judges on the federal, I can't remember their political.
Justice Stevens is the only voice of dissent who ruled in favor with the lower courts, saying that the police officer was in the wrong. The other 8 Supreme Court justices said that the police officer was in the right.
Right, but I didn't know what those 8 political leanings, because I'm not familiar with them.
They're mostly Republican.
Yeah.
That's what my point. Thanks.
Yeah.
I see you have friends in the court.
Go ahead.
Stuart Dambrot, physiological psychologist. 3 quick points. Quick to defer. First, in terms of the attention versus perception discussion, have there been or are any experiments planned to take place that address unmedicated ADHD patients in terms of their deficit in attention relative to modulated perception. So that's one. The second is in terms of, we're talking a lot about cognitive effects and cognitive processes in the modulation of perception, but it brought to mind from a very long time ago glasses that invert the visual field. And after a couple of days, the visual cortex accommodates. And when they're removed, the world is seen inverted for a couple of days until the visual cortex reaccommodates. So that is not a cognitive bias. That's a neocortical process unto itself, which indicates a kind of almost a motivation ascribed to some form of Piaget lighthouse, if you will, as homunculus. And lastly, when you were talking about the real world, have you been influenced at all by Gibson's ecological psychology or Barker's environmental psychology?
The last question is the easiest. I got my PhD at Cornell, so where Jimmy Gibson and Eleanor Gibson spent most of their career. So whether I wanted to or not, I was influenced by the Gibsons.
I thought so.
Yeah, it was not by choice. It was by birth, I guess. And the whole point of studying Gibson is that we're immersed in a much greater environment, and that we need to take the more global environment into account when we study any kind of phenomenon. Gibson would not like my perspective, I think, of how hard I'm arguing that it affects visual perception, but the more global point about ecological validity and taking science outside of the lab and taking it out of context and looking at the environment and the surrounding context, as Larry was saying, the context matters. That is certainly influencing, I think, a lot of our discussions.
Although you might persuade him to consider that as part of his own theory of the ecological aspect also involves evolutionary attunement to invariant features of the perceptual environment, and as such it takes into account not only reticular activating formation and limbic system activity and its effect on visual perception, but the actual meaning that is extracted, as you put it, from the visual field. So, this time.
On the second issue about the inverting lenses, so I've read the original papers in this sense. The description you gave is the one that a lot of people think is what happened, but actually it's a complete myth. So what happened was,
they were at the lecture and he lied to us.
What happened was the people could ride a bike, they could read the inverted writing, but that doesn't mean it looked the same. I actually had a detailed conversation with one of the subjects, Seymour Papert, who explained that things never really looked the way they used to. In fact, he said that some things looked right side up and other things looked upside down, even if they were next to one another. He said it made him dizzy to even talk about it. However, that being said, the visual system and all our perceptual systems are enormously plastic. And there are other, there are, for example, prism adaptation, the things to make everything move to the left. And you do adapt to that very, very quickly, and things do look normal. And, someone who wears a blindfold for a week, the whole visual cortex can be taken over for reading Braille. And then you take the blindfold off, and in a few hours it goes back. So certainly our perceptual systems are very, very plastic, but that doesn't challenge modularity. So the modules can be rewired over time, but are constantly. But the idea is there's still modules that still work in an automatic way.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Anyone else?
Yes.
Sorry. The ADHD.
Well, let me quickly just say that actually the study of ADHD and perceptual or attentional biases is quite understudied. In fact, I read a lot of this literature, and I don't know anything, and my graduate student is right here, and she just looked it up, and she also says that there hasn't been any work done that she's aware of or that she could find right now. It's mostly studied within anxiety, the role of attentional biases and perceptual experiences in anxiety. And that work is just very fascinating. And also when we're trying to figure out, well, what are the strategies to help people, then how can we help? If it's happening at the level of perception, you could say, oh, that's so early, what could you possibly do? It seems fruitless. Except if you allow it to be at the level of attention. And how can we redirect their attention, have them take in a more global environment so that they see that what causes them anxiety, that face in the audience, the one face that's scowling, well, that's one. If you look in the bigger audience, everyone else is smiling. Can we shape attention? Can we direct attention in ways to help mitigate the anxiety-producing elements of the environment? There's a lot of work done on that. And the answer is yes. There's a lot of room for therapeutic intervention within the role of attention in anxiety. Yeah.
I'm Rebecca Coleman Curtis. I'm a psychoanalyst and a researcher. Got a PhD in social psych originally. Having reviewed the research on anxiety, there isn't any, needless to say, experimentally where you threaten people with their lives or with their whole meaning systems. And so that research doesn't actually apply so well to clinical situations. What I wanted to throw out was a simple rubric and hear what you think of it. Really comes more from the anthropologist Ernst Becker. This is in a book I published last year, Unifying Science and Psychoanalysis, that you can think of the major motivations as being related to both survival, sort of animalistic type things, and survival of the meaning system. Obviously, there are some people for whom the way they make meaning in the world is more important than physical survival. And if you start out with that differentiation and you think about people as both experiencing the sort of animal self, vision would be included there, and then you have the meaning-making parts, and indeed the preservation of the meaning-making part, staying sane, you can then think about the change that occurs. And let me just say that William James commented that I can't give his exact quote, but where motivation is affecting everything that we attend to and remember. He says it selects all the while, so everything is selective attention and inattention that goes on with organisms. But then if you apply that to the change process, you've got two different ways that change takes place. It change in humans I'm focusing on. It takes place in terms of their actual experiences. Behaviorists do a lot of this. And then you've got the meanings of experiences, which cognitive therapists and psychoanalysts have been looking at. And you can go at it by both routes. And I'll just add one more thing. I did publish a study, which is exactly what you said, Larry. It's in Journal of Personality and Social Psych. Believing another person likes or dislikes you, behavior is making the beliefs come true. So anyway, any comments on that? Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think your comments are very interesting. As I mentioned earlier, that we know something about the neural circuitry underlying reward, and this is the circuitry that's critical, for example, learning where food is, learning where sexual partners are, and going and getting it. And this we share not just with other mammals, but probably with reptiles. And so this, you would think, would be fairly hard to change. But as you or override, better yet, very hard to override. But I'm fascinated, too, by hunger strikers, people like Bobby Sands from the IRA and Gandhi and all of these people who were able to override it.
What about anorexia?
And I'll get there. Right. Well, I'm talking particularly about starving yourself to death, which shouldn't happen. It doesn't happen in the reptilian and mammalian world. I don't know of hunger striker mice or things like that. That just doesn't happen.
An octopus that killed himself. I think it was reported. No,
Oh, right. I kind of heard about it, and I don't know what to make of that. But in any event, in the human brain, a difference between the human brain and the mammalian brain, the main difference has to do with an extension of the frontal lobes. Okay? And in that extension, well, part of what that extension does seems to mediate what some people call cognitive control or executive processes. And there are direct connections from those most highly developed levels down to the reward circuitry to kind of control the reward circuitry. So it's got to be something like that when you get someone who is literally in a hunger strike. Okay? That's what I think. Anorexia, I think, is different, and I think there's evidence now to suggest it's different. In anorexia, the food starts to lose its taste, and the reward system is no longer telling you, go get it. It doesn't taste that great. But it's going to, our best...
But I think it takes time for it to get to that point. The
yes,
question is,
absolutely.
How does it take time? How does it happen until it gets to that point? Once it gets to that point I understand.
Right.
But there is a long period before...
It may be a punishment, too.
Well, there is... I mean, the obvious thing to say is one cause of anorexia that people report, mostly women, has to do with changes in the perception of their body, and that their perceptions, this goes back to our perceptual stories, the perception is way, way off. The bias is incredible. And so that part of what's driving the initial loss of weight might be something like that, presumably acting through the cognitive control mechanism in the prefrontal cortex, and then the reward system gets screwed up. It loses its positivity about the taste, and
but
then you're in trouble.
The reward system then becomes screwed up, as you say?
That was a technical term.
That's not that because the skinniness or so on becomes the source of the, or even the not eating becomes the reward.
Well, it wouldn't be the not eating. It would be you seeing yourself, the image of yourself in a mirror or something like that could be rewarding. I don't know if that's the case. Or you literally start... We're actually looking into doing something about this. Whether you actually show that food is less appetitive, tastes less good, as determined by activity in certain critical parts of this reward region.
I'd like to just add one comment, that once you start talking about the perception of oneself, you're in a much more complicated realm than we've been talking about.
Hi, I'm Ellen Fried, and I am actually a PhD in biology. And it may
Put the...
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I'm a biologist, and I do fairly basic research now, but I have a long-term interest in psychology and actually have an undergraduate degree and did some work with Marty Seligman when I was an undergraduate at Penn. In any case, I came here today with a kind of underlying motive that I might take away something more general in my own thinking about something that I struggle with, and I'm sure all of you struggle with in your own lives, and that is how to motivate others in work, mostly, or, well, and other things as well. And I'm wondering to what extent any of you can give me some words of wisdom about what you think about that and how your perceptions from your work have influenced how you think about that.
I have a colleague at Columbia in psychology named Tori Higgins who's writing a book about that. And he makes a basic distinction between two kinds of motivational systems. It's kind of like approach and avoid. So in one kind of motivational system is concerned with accumulating gains. It's sort of like the positive outlook. It's kind of an approach system. He calls it a promotion system because you're looking to obtain things, you're looking to get gains, and so on. And the other system is a prevention system. You're trying to avoid losses and not make mistakes. And everybody has both. But we vary in which system can dominate. And his idea about how to motivate people, which I think is very good, is different jobs require different kinds of motivation. So there can be jobs, one would hope, for example, that surgeons are somewhat prevention-focused, whereas startup companies might be more promotion-focused. So you really want to consider what will constitute success in this particular job, and whether you want it to, whether you're going to have someone who's more prevention-focused or promotion-focused. I didn't say that well. You want to fit the job to the person, or fit the person to the job in terms of their motivational systems.
Thank you. You can talk after me.
Okay.
I'm Fritz Kenzel. I'm a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. I'm working on a theory of multiple unconscious development, unconscious motivational tracks that we develop along. I defined 16 such tracks, so I think we're full of unconscious intentions. Somewhere between the unconscious as a biological drive and conscious intention. So there's this host. I've defined 37 unconscious destructive intentions. Let's look at that for the moment. Is Justice Breyer unconsciously concocting the events, whereas the other juries did not? Is your subject unconsciously intending idealization to see the male as hot, whereas the one that's not available is not going to see the male as hot? That is that trigger, that unconscious idealization is not working. So I just want to share with you all. I think these unconscious constructive intentions, which is how we develop, and then destructive unconscious intentions, which hold back our normal motivation and make us biologically stuck in earlier development. I think they very definitely do influence those. I'd like you to reflect on unconscious concocting. Do people start concocting weapons of mass destruction? So, in other words, is there a process of making stuff up? That's what I see. Whereas most of the juries know they're not concocting, so that's what they see as more objective.
So I think the answer is yes, that exactly this role of the unconscious and concoction or storytelling or narrative, as Jerry studies it, is very important. When you take any one real-world phenomenon, we in the lab try to boil it down to one explanation that we're going to see as a possible explanation. It's not going to be the whole story, so there's never one phenomenon or one mechanism that's going to produce the phenomenon when you study something in the real world. So, of course, unconscious concocting happens. You can take an event that's happened and then ask people to reflect upon it and make decisions, and that's Jerry's work with legal decision-making, is the idea of narrative. We already have a story about how do African Americans interact when they're with a police officer or when they live in this neighborhood? And we have these stories that are told by society, or that are told in the courtroom when a lawyer presents one case, one side of the story, and another lawyer presents another. And all of that shapes how we think about the evidence and shapes how we watch it when we're shown it on the screen. So the idea of narrative that can come from just living a life and developing it at an unconscious level, or a narrative that's established because somebody is telling you the story that shapes your perceptual experience, your understanding at that point. They all matter. They all matter.
Would you like to say something?
The only thing I want to say, backing up that one, it's impossible to conceive of the way in which we can conceive without those narratives. Mm-hmm. They're absolutely necessary, because you walk in time. These things exist in time. They provide the context. So we don't know very much about them yet, so we're busily studying. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Peter Irwin. I have been involved in clinical development of drugs for treating brain illnesses. I thought that perhaps in this discussion we were going to understand the relationship between meaning and motivation in a kind of a sequential process, where we first sort of break out how we arrive, where we first, thank you very much, sorry, where we first break out how we arrive at meaning, and then that kind of leads us to motivation. And I thought perhaps you might comment then on, in terms of how we arrive at meaning, there are a couple things that sort of come to my mind right away. One, I've got a new grandchild, so I pay attention, or I spend a little time looking at her and trying to imagine what's going on in her mind and how she's trying to organize all that she's perceiving. And then another very brief anecdote, when I was a young man in research, one of the first things I sort of got interested in was imagining how a blind person was perceiving the world. And there was a attractive young lady in the lab, and I said, gee whiz, would you try an experiment with me? And she met me at a local place and put a blindfold on me and then took me back to her apartment. And we visited a couple of times. And what I was trying to do was see whether or not I could perceive, I could do a transition in my mind instead of having a visual understanding of the apartment, whether her apartment would then become a tactile space, and whether or not meaning and my understanding of the whole space in which I was in would in some way transition into tactile meaning, because clearly all your visual perceptions for a person who's blind, they would have to have meanings of things tactily. I was never very successful because I presume that a lot of the meanings we have are overlearned, and that becomes a problem, I think, when we talk about even like things like cognitive impenetrability, because we've overlearned things and automatized them so much. It may be very difficult to demonstrate that it is penetrable, although some of the perceptual things probably are occurring in the eye, and it's for that reason the eye, the brain part of the eye, and for that reason it may be impenetrable. And anyway, if you could just sort of comment on how we get from meaning later then to motivation.
Ned? So on your blindfold experiment.
That was a picking up technique. That wasn't just
really interesting date.
picking up level off. No.
One thing about vision and touch is they share a huge neural substrate, largely in the so-called visual cortex, which turns out to be largely multisensory. It has a big multisensory spatial component. And this is much detailed in a really quite interesting book called The Handbook of Multisensory Perception. And there are a couple of articles in that book that give interesting, information about multisensory perception. One of the most interesting bodies of experiments comes from a guy named Sathian, who was at Emory. And he did, just to give you one experiment that he did, which shows he took normal people and blindfolded them, and then put their finger on a grid that had both a direction, could be going this way or that way, and a texture. So they could feel both the texture and the direction. And then he used a device that's often used in cognitive neuroscience called transcranial magnetic stimulation, which it's a coil that you put on the surface of on the scalp, and you can zap areas and temporarily cause temporary brain damage.
Lasts only a half an hour, they say.
Well, that's repetitive. That's repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation. That wasn't used in this. This is very brief. I think that I would not submit to repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation.
Maybe once.
What?
Maybe once.
Maybe once. Well, of course, once you've done it once, you have no judgment left. But anyway, what they found was that if they zapped the somatosensory cortex, there's a band of somatosensory cortex going across the brain like this, then these people could not feel either the direction or the texture. But if they zapped the visual cortex, these blindfolded people could feel the texture but not the orientation. So the visual cortex was controlling their perception of the orientation, the tactile orientation of these lines. So which is an interesting bit of many bits of evidence that there are multi-sensory areas that we classify as visual but are actually better classified as spatial.
Do you think perception of music comes into that? I mean, is that an explanation?
You know, this is I've been interested in this, but I have done no reading on it. I'm sure somebody knows about this, but I don't.
Okay, well, question.
Yes, hi. I'm Jerry Hurwitz. I'm a psychiatrist. I really enjoyed the discussion today. I thought it was fantastic. I wonder a little bit about this, whether we're making a little bit of a sort of a homuncular sort of error in separating meaning from motivation perhaps as much as we do. And maybe there are certain perceptions, maybe the ones that are so cognitively impenetrable, et cetera, which are, let's say, purely perceptual. But I'm wondering, you know, when there's this discussion of the illusions, these unconscious illusions that the persistence of unconscious illusions when these figures are manipulated and whatnot, that what we really can say about those people is that they're disposed to, let's say, bisect the line in a different place. Not so much that they have a perception of it that's of the sort, and therefore they, you know, bisect it. We can't really say whether they have a perception because they can't report that to us. So now I wonder whether these two different systems, at least for certain types of phenomena, certain types of experiences, are really interwoven. That is motivation and perception. What I'm also thinking of here is this notion of anhedonia and the lack of motivation and reward systems in individuals. We typically think of the big sort of sexy things that are motivating, like sex, of course, food for some of us. Food for all. Yeah, for all of us. But, you know, really when we get down to it in our normal conscious experience, everything in our perceptual field has some motivating there's a valence, a motivation valence to everything in our visual field and in our experience. I see a glass of water, I'm thirsty right now. I have a certain feeling about that picture now that might be different than if I was not thirsty, or if I had anhedonia. The world will look very, very different, I put forward. So again, what about this idea that at some point these two systems, it's not so much that motivation affects perceptions, but motivation is part of perception?
Who wants to tackle it?
Look, there's a lot of work that does suggest that motivation is very wrapped up. That we evaluate everything we see. You know, this was actually discovered in terms of language many, many years ago by Charles Osgood, who was able to show, he constructed something he called the semantic differential, and one of the dimensions was positivity or negativity. Every word in the language is one that has a positive or a negative dimension.
I think I agree with your intuitions and observations about how so many different things can have a motivational salience, and I think there's quite a bit of evidence for that in the kinds of cognitive and behavioral studies that have been done for over 100 years, and that's now a real issue at the level of brain work of how that comes to be, given what the reward circuitry must start off with. So,
the example that you gave of the wrench gun.
She's the
wrench gun.
She's the wrench gun.
You all three commented on it, I believe, but the idea of, well, what was that person who answered that question actually saying? Because the idea of it being a perception was totally vague. Was it even a perception that caused me to respond the way I did? I had a disposition, and I kind of had a perception or perceptual experience that was involved, but really it was a gestalt, right?
Well, I think that fits with kind of the spirit of Emily's work. Can I just add one correction to my dear friend Ned? Transcranial magnetic stimulation does not cause temporary brain damage. It's a metaphor. It changes the functioning, not the structural aspects.
You can give it to him as much as he...
Let me correct my friend Ed. Let me give you an example.
Okay.
Rebecca Sachs has identified this area. She calls the extra body.
Yeah.
It's a different area I'm thinking. She's identified an area a brain area that she found with fMRI. So let me start again. So she gave people 3 kinds of stories. One kind of story described the physical appearance. Another kind of story described perceptions of people. And a third story described people's thoughts and beliefs. And she found a brain area that lit up only for the thoughts and beliefs, not for the perceptions and not for the physical. So this area seems to have something very much to do with attributing thoughts and beliefs to other people. She then used transcranial magnetic stimulation on this area, repetitive, the kind that Emily was talking about, that puts this, 20 minutes, puts this area to sleep. And what she found was that so she gave subjects moral evaluation tests. And the moral evaluation tests involved things where somebody produced a good or a bad result, either intentionally or accidentally. For example, there's a coffee cup, there's some white powder. You put the white powder in the coffee cup. The person drinks it, it turns out it's poison, and he dies. Or the person drinks it, it's sugar, and he tastes good. And what was varied was, did the person know it was poison? And did he put it in the coffee cup in order to poison the person? And what she found was, if you put that area to sleep, all people, and they're judging whether the person is guilty or innocent, it's just the consequences. They lose all sense.
That's fine. They don't have brain damage.
But they act exactly as people do when that area is damaged. So this is temporary brain damage. It acts just like.
But what's happened is you've changed the functioning of the area, not the structure. Brain damage refers to tissue damage.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. It's not functioning as it usually does.
Okay. The very last question.
My name is Mordecai Newman. I'm an attorney. You spoke earlier about how unconscious visual stimuli can be assimilated and affect perception. I was wondering if the same thing applies to auditory stimuli. If, for example, a person who's under anesthesia, if things are said in his presence or even in the course of normal sleep, can that affect normal perception?
You should jump
I think it's been shown that conversations can be a matter of concern in surgical departments, that all kinds of, if any of you know surgeons personally, you know they're not really highly refined in their conversation, is my experience as an overworked intern. And some of the raw conversation that goes on while a patient is under anesthesia can have a definite effect and not a good effect, and it's of concern. It's been shown and is being worked on.
So this is a difficult area. And the problem with that anesthesia work, there was a study some years ago by John Kilstrom which pointed out the problem, which is that in real life operations where people are under anesthesia, the anesthesiologist is highly motivated to make the anesthesia as light as you can get away with, because it's damaging. Heavy anesthesia is damaging. So you never know how light the anesthesia is.
What about sleep?
Well, but let me just... So the thing about visual perception is we have a highly controlled method of creating unconscious perception. This thing I mentioned called continuous flash suppression. There is no such method for auditory perception, so we don't know how to produce unconscious auditory perception. Well, there is an exception. but we don't quite know as well what it's doing.
Let me mention one thing quickly, and then I'll stop. 20, 30 years ago, I remember there was a series of motivational tapes that were sold. And I assumed at the time that they were bogus.
Yes.
They were.
Yes. Okay. So that was exactly what I was going to say, but then you ended with anesthesia. I don't know anything about anesthesia, but I do know about these motivational tapes. And that was the question. In the 70s, it was really big. Can we affect big behavioral changes with absolutely no work at all? Can we get people to lose 20 pounds in their sleep if they listen to these motivational tapes? So there was Tony Greenwald did this study. He looked at the tapes. He mail ordered the infomercial, whatever the version was in the 70s, but by mail order got these tapes. 2 types of tapes, one for weight loss and one for being smarter, academic achievement or something like that. In a double-blind experiment, so the participants didn't really know what tapes they were getting, and the experimenter didn't really know what they were giving, but a third person did. They mixed up the labels of the tapes, right? So it's a double-blind experiment. People are supposed to put the headphones on every night for 2 weeks. They listen to the content of the tapes. There's a little bit, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, I'm not sure, of lag time at the beginning, so people fall asleep. And then when they're asleep, they hear either messages that are supposed to help them meet their weight loss goals or improve their academic performance. The tapes were labeled. The only thing that had an effect was the label of the tapes. So whether people thought they were supposed to be losing weight or thought they were supposed to be getting smarter with the tapes produced weight loss or produced change in math and math testing scores, the DVs that they use. But the content of the tapes had absolutely no effect.
But they do work.
The placebo effect works.
Thank you, everybody.